Aerial bombardment did sort of take quite a centre stage role in discussions of aerial doctrine in the interwar period, because it was sort of considered a means of breaking the sort of the messy and the gruesome deadlock that was seen in the trenches in between 1914 to 1918. So it really was in the public conscious, and particularly in Britain, because it had been bombed before in Gotha raids during the First World War, and so there was a bit more paranoia and perhaps a little bit more awareness in Britain than there was in Germany. But the sort of the hopes and fears, the fears perhaps stood out more than the hopes, simply because of the fact that aerial bombardment was sort of treated as a bit of a deterrent rather than something that should be wielded, and it was a bit of a last resort option. So it's sort of how we consider nuclear warfare today, that it's sort of the unspoken thing that you could use in aerial warfare, but you probably shouldn't. So they were sort of mainly the fears in terms of the idea with Stanley Baldwin that the bomber would always get through from 1932. And so aerial bombardment sort of seemed this kind of movement that couldn't be stopped, and really all that could be done was to try and not get to a diplomatic situation in which aerial bombardment became a real reality. In the interwar period, France hadn't really envisioned the bombardment of German cities. It didn't really have an effective and a thorough doctrine that had been developed for that purpose. And in Germany, particularly from sort of the mid-1930s, the doctrine was more weighted over to the idea of strategic bombardment, particularly with General Walter Weber, who very much drew sort of all aspects of strategic bombardment in terms of oil refineries, in terms of aircraft factories, and all of these different strategic points. And when he was killed in an air crash in 1936, the Luftwaffe sort of increasingly retreated away from the idea of strategic bombardment and sort of shaped their force more for hard-hitting, heavy attacks, but short attacks, more in what would become Blitzkrieg, in order to try and win a short war, because Hitler didn't want to be getting drawn into a long war of attrition. Germany, of course, had a bit of an upper hand in terms of the fact that, as with incidents like Guernica, and of course, you know, from 1939, you're sort of having the bombing of Warsaw and all of those horrific images coming in, it did certainly seem as if the Luftwaffe could be an unstoppable force, although Britain wasn't entirely, it didn't entirely buy into the sort of alarmist rumours that it was completely impregnable. And indeed, British witnesses in Germany in the interwar period, so, for example, looking at the Luftwaffe aircraft that invaded Austria and created the Anschluss, weren't entirely impressed by what they were seeing. But, of course, they sort of saw the dredges of the Luftwaffe because the rest were stationed in Germany rather than in Austria. So there was perhaps a little bit more of an international image, and particularly with the dramatic unveiling of the Luftwaffe in 1935, that it was stronger than it really was. And German historians have referred to this term of the Luftwaffe being mehr Schein als Sein, which is the concept of it being more image than reality. But in terms of numbers, the Luftwaffe was very much sort of, it was stationed for the war, it had been preparing for the war. Was it completely at full operational strength? No, but it was sufficient enough to be causing great concern to the Allies early on in 1939 and 1940. In the Battle of Britain, the Germans sort of struggled with recognising the importance of radar, of attacking radar stations specifically. They weren't quite sure exactly, how far the system had expanded, and of course it was quite a sophisticated system of being developed as the Dowding system from the early 1930s. So they didn't quite grasp specifically how important radar would be with chain home, and of course with chain home low during the battle. But their system really was just to try and paralyse as many RAF airfields as possible, and to continue going into those specific targets, not just airfields, but of course attacking the hangars as well, and sort of their potential aircraft targets that were in production too. That was more sort of their strategy, but the issue was that there perhaps wasn't quite so much consistency as they needed in order to completely wipe out the airfields, in order to pave the way for Operation Sea Lion. Well, during the Battle of Britain, the Luftwaffe did have the advantage that, of course, daylight raids were king, and obviously they changed to nighttime bombing sort of during the Blitz because it's much easier to be to flying without being detected. So they sort of had that advantage in that they had the visuals of bombing in daylight. But the issue was that the Germans didn't necessarily have particularly sophisticated navigational aids at that point. They were only starting to experiment with the likes of X-Gerät and Knickerbein. And so because these sort of navigational aids were sort of in their infancy and weren't really utilised until a little bit later on in the war, they could struggle a little bit more with being particularly precise. So those, you do have the advantage of, if you're attacking an airfield, you're not having to pick out targets in an urban area. You are focusing on that specific hangar amidst fields of grass. So in that respect, it was easier to locate the RAF airfields than it was specific targets in the Blitz later on. In comparison to the raids that London experienced from the Gothas in the First World War, the scale of the Blitz was Armageddon. It was all across the country, so not just in London, but of course up in the industrial Midlands, all the way up to the northeast and even touching Scotland. And so it was on an immense scale that hitherto hadn't really been experienced by the British and indeed by other nations. And it was also so intense because of the fact that German bombers could come over several times a night. It wasn't just one raid. You'd have all of the emergency services coming out and trying to repair burst water pipes and trying to deal with casualties. And then the next raid would be along. And sometimes these raids could be up to 200, 300 bombers each time, although they were normally less. So really the impact, the scale of the Blitz, even if its effects weren't always necessarily long-term, and the sort of objectives of morale and of affecting war production weren't always achieved, they were very much on a scale that Britain and parts of the world had not seen before. For the Germans, the Blitz was incredibly variable. There were certain nights where they would drop a lot of their bombs in entirely the wrong place, often for the case of inexperienced crews that panicked at the anti-aircraft or got lost amongst Britain's sort of winding coastlines. And they didn't always necessarily hit in the right places because German navigational aids were still not necessarily in their infancy, but they were still developing. But they did have certain points at which the Blitz was very successful. And perhaps the most obvious example of that was Operation Moonlight Sonata, which was the decimation of Coventry in November 1940. And this gave birth to the German verb of konzentrieren, which means to concentrate, to absolutely decimate it. And this was particularly successful because of Coventry being a medieval city, because of it being dominated by wooden materials, of being dominated by historical buildings, and also it saw the use of one of the more effective means of X-Gerät earlier on. So the Blitz for Germany was variable and it did sustain considerable losses, but there were certain points that would stand out amidst their other actions over Rotterdam, over Warsaw, and in that respect they were quite successful. Arthur Bomber Harris became Bomber Command's Commander-in-Chief in February 1942, at a time when Bomber Command was sort of going through a dark night of the soul. It was sustaining immense losses and really not hitting quite a lot in Germany, and it hadn't really improved much from the earlier days of the war when it was only dropping leaflets and pinpointing certain parts of German shipping. He definitely had a lot of different directives that he needed to follow in terms of improving accuracy, over the industrial targets in Germany. So the Butt report in 1941 had reported that only 1 in 10 bombs were hitting the right place in the Ruhr, or even just within 5 miles, not necessarily the target. He needed to improve efficiency, and he needed to not necessarily reduce losses, but to see more be gained for those losses. So Harris had a lot on his plate when he took up the role. Bomber Harris was quite clearly an advocate of area bombing over strategic bombing. He sort of looked at it in an experimental way, which of course would add to his controversy at the end of the war in terms of whether area bombing to that extent and degree, so at Hamburg, at Dresden, was really necessary. But he believed in it quite strongly, especially having seen Britain sort of struggling in the Blitz and seeing that impact, seeing London go up in flames himself. He very much did subscribe to that interwar theory that area bombing would crack civilian morale and would impede war production immensely. With Bomber Harris at the helm, immediate effects were seen in Bomber Command, immediate results which vastly outstripped any other raids conducted over Germany before. So with the bombing of Lübeck, with only 200 bombers, half the city was destroyed. And of course with Cologne, with the first 1,000 bomber raid, which was designed, this armada was designed to really capture the British and the Allied imagination for being the biggest air armada to date. That sort of impact from very early on in taking over Bomber Command was what sort of convinced Harris that area bombing was the way to go over precision bombing, and that is why he then executed the rest of the war in that vein. Bomber Harris should perhaps be remembered as a man that was doing his job, but perhaps a man that enjoyed doing his job too much. Because the issue with it was the fact that he was quite experimental in his techniques, and of course some of this was in terms of simply trying to win the war as quickly as possible. Some of it did come from a bit of a twisted humanitarianism side, in that he wanted to shorten the war and shorten the time in which casualties had to be sustained for the Allies. But it was quite clear that, especially compared to the Americans and even to other figures within Bomber Command, that he had a lot less disregard for German lives, and it didn't matter if they were soldiers, it didn't matter if they were women, if they were children. To him, that sort of unit all represented the German war economy, the German war machine, and ultimately the Nazi regime. So in that respect, probably enjoyed it a little bit. Well, not enjoyed it, but relished in it a little bit too much. And that's why he remains controversial, because he never sought to defend it. The Battle of the Ruhr was very important for the combined bomber offensive because of the fact that it avoided the same issues that came with bombing cultural German cities, in the fact that the Ruhr was the Waffenschmiede des Reiches. It was the armory of the Reich. And so it contained so many important factories, manufacturing plants, and also oil refineries. And as a result, it really was the heartland of German industry during the war. And so the switch to it in 1943 was a vital part of trying to cripple Germany's war production. The Dambusters raid stood out so keenly against the Battle of the Ruhr because of the fact that it exemplified precision bombing to a level that had never been previously achieved. And even though it did cause 1,300 civilian casualties, there was no doubt that the attacking of the Möhne and the Eder and the Sorpe dams constituted legitimate military targets. So because of that, it could be shown in such a way that its effects could be celebrated in wartime Britain, because it didn't have the same sort of issues in terms of the clear-cut bombing of cities versus the impact of production in the Ruhr region. So Operation Chastise really stood out amongst the existing Battle of the Ruhr operations, simply because it exemplified precision bombing to a level that had never been seen before. The debate over how military successful it really was tends to go towards two different sides. There's the idea of the fact that it shocked the Nazi leadership, that Hitler called it this disaster in the West, that he had this issue of trying to stem the flow of the dams immediately. It wasn't damage that could just be left. So it had that shock blow to the Nazi leadership. But equally, there is the debate that it wasn't quite as effective as is often portrayed, or was certainly portrayed in the wartime press, simply because the Germans had patched up the dams by September 1943, and with the addition of a few more flak guns and a little bit more protection, resources weren't completely moved over to it as much as the Allies were hoping for, although they did move labourers away from the Atlantic Wall, which ultimately may well have helped contribute to how the war ran towards the end. The Allies sort of changed their bombing strategy towards the end of 1943 and 1944 in the fact that they could go further than they had ever done before. They started to get navigational aids. They were sort of using more frequently G and then oboe and then H2S towards the end, which allowed Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force to penetrate more deeply into Germany, and with a bit more success. And of course, there was the difference of the fact that the impact of sort of having these 4-engine bombers, of having the Stirlings, having Halifaxes, having Lancasters, meant that larger loads could be dropped than in the first half of the war. So from 1943, 1944, and particularly sort of pleased with the success of incidents like Hamburg, Bomber Command and the 8th Air Force really did have to ramp up their bombing campaigns against German cities. Big Week was particularly important for the Americans because it helped to instill some confidence into their bomber offensive. They'd had really variable results once they had started the combined bomber offensive. So, for instance, their raids in 1943 on Schweinfurt, on its ball bearings factories, had been a mitigated disaster. They'd lost 68% of their force, and it was numbers that they simply couldn't sustain. So Big Week was very important because of the fact that even though they still incurred a lot of losses, they had started to really lure the German fighters up into the air and to attack them head on and face to face, and inflict significant losses in that respect. And Big Week was also very important because of the fact that it saw changes in the way that American bombers and fighters interacted with each other, in terms of the fact that they could now deal more effectively with the Sturmböcke, which were reinforced Focke-Wulf 190s that were having a lot of success when the fighters were very close to the bombers. But with Lieutenant General Doolittle's advice to have the fighters separate away from the bombers and to pick out the German fighters, particularly with the introduction of the Mustang, being able to chase down these really slow, lumbering Sturmböcke Focke-Wulf 190s, it really did see an impact in how many German fighters were shot down and how many more American bombers could come through. For a long time, the Luftwaffe's fighters had been at the cutting edge of aeronautical technology during the war. But the issue was that as it started to struggle from Operation Barbarossa from 1942 to 1943, they weren't always able to rush in new aircraft and able to supersede their old ones. So their Bf 109s and their Focke-Wulf 190s were sort of having lots of different modifications and having different marks. But it didn't necessarily mean that they were bringing in aircraft that could win the war. And indeed, when they were looking into the Messerschmitt 262, it was coming a little bit too late. And for the Allies, on the other hand, they started to have, particularly the American fighters, they would have Mustangs, they would have Thunderbolts. They had these aircraft that started to absolutely decimate German fighters and really did strike fear into the heart of the Luftwaffe. So in that respect, and particularly with the ramped up production in Allied aircraft, they could of course replace their aircraft a lot faster than the Luftwaffe could. It really did put the Germans in a corner and start to have an impact on how well they could fight back. Dresden initially didn't start as a particularly high target for Bomber Command. And on the Ministry of Economic Warfare and the K-8 Division's list of industrial targets in Germany, it initially only listed 22nd, with Berlin, of course, being first. So at first, it wasn't particularly a target for the Allies, but by 1945, it had become a lot more relevant to the combined bomber offensive because, of course, the Russians were coming in through the east. And Dresden served as an incredibly important link between Dresden, Leipzig, Berlin. And the issue with that was the fact that it then, by that very nature, made it relevant to the war effort, and also as a means of sort of impressing the Russians, but also trying to show their strength, trying to show Allied strength against the Russians by blasting into Dresden in order to let the Red Army advance through it. Dresden was relevant by 1945. The degree to which it was attacked was arguably not necessary, considering how low it had ranked on the targeting sheets before. But to say that it wasn't a military legitimate target is somewhat debatable. Dresden was particularly successful because of its unique weather conditions, because of the fact that it had such an extreme mixture of the heat from the firestorm and, of course, the cold air coming in from the cold February night. It really caused this astonishing fire tornado that sucked in people, sucked in cars, sucked in objects from buildings, and allowed it to rage for so long. And Bomber Command didn't necessarily know that it was going to cause that much damage, but at the same time, it absolutely was not blind to the idea that this would cause immense devastation. And in its briefing documents for its air crews, for its bomber crews, it very much pointed out that there were refugees pouring into the city from the east, from the advancing Soviets, and also the fact that it was an ideal target because of all of its medieval and its historical buildings. So even though it was perhaps a little more successful than the Allies intended, and that's why it was so controversial, it was so damaging, it was nevertheless along the lines of what it expected to happen. It's arguably inaccurate to describe Dresden as a war crime, not because its criteria wouldn't be fulfilled, but because the necessary law, the international law that deemed and defined war crimes, didn't exist in February 1945. So it's historically inaccurate because of the fact that it was incidents like Dresden that formed the notion of war crimes that we understand today. From a law perspective, it wasn't a war crime. But that doesn't mean that it didn't breach international law in a variety of mediums and could also be defended by international law from a variety of mediums. So Dresden was arguably a war crime in all but name. Dresden was arguably a legitimate military target because of the fact that it was placed only 20 minutes flying time from the Russians. It was more or less going to be a battlefield, and the fact that the city was quietly made a Verteidigungsbereich, which was a defensive area by the Germans, which is a temporary fortress which is designed to be defended to the last man. And also the fact it had been protected by flak in the past. So it was a target, but the means to which it was attacked and it was destroyed was arguably disproportionate. simply because of the fact that Dresden had ranked so low on Bomber Command and 8th Air Force target lists before, and also because it simply wasn't on the level of cities such as Chemnitz or indeed Hamburg before in its military output. So the attack on Dresden was arguably merited but disproportionate. Strategic bombing in the Second World War can't be defined in terms of how much it shortened the war by how many months or how many years, because there's simply far too many variables and too many factors into that. But even though the strategic bombing offensive couldn't really be seen as a shortcut for the end of the war, it certainly did pave the way towards victory, because it interfered with oil production, it interfered with civilian morale, it did interfere with aircraft production on quite a dramatic scale. And although German production wasn't necessarily impeded quite so much between 1942 to 1944, the fact that it didn't meet the aircraft production expectations for 1945. So, for example, they were expecting 80,000 fighters and they only came out with 32,000, really did make a difference in what the Luftwaffe could throw at the Allies. And so the strategic bombing offensive certainly did contribute immensely to the end of the war, but how much it shortened it is still up for debate. Perhaps one of the most enduring side effects of the Allied bombing campaign was the fact that it did hasten the disintegration of the Luftwaffe. So it did interfere with having to overstretch the Luftwaffe in so many geographical locations, dealing with the Soviets in the east, dealing with Normandy and the D-Day events in 1944, and of course defending the home front as well from aerial attack. And so it really ran the Luftwaffe ragged. It had to deal with the fact that its oil production was being affected, and so there was a lot less fuel going around for the Luftwaffe to test its new fighters before being delivered to the airfields. And also interfering with how much flight time its new pilots would get before it was thrown into the fray. And at its worst, towards the end of the war, the Allies had more than twice the amount of flying time as training pilots as the Germans did. So it really did make an impact in that respect, in terms of interfering with how the Luftwaffe worked and where it could be most effective. Neither side in the bombing offensive of the Second World War can really claim moral superiority, because the whole issue with it is that they had both sort of descended to each other's level. The Allies, of course, did have the benefit from their side of partially sort of launching the bombing offensive in terms of helping to liberate the concentration camps, for instance. And indeed at Dresden, for instance, there was reports that some prisoners of Auschwitz and Theresienstadt were being transported from Dresden. So there are certain cities that were involved in the Holocaust, which perhaps were impeded by the bombing offensive. But in terms of the means deployed, the sort of disproportionate damage in certain areas, it was a war that defied all sort of precedent, all sort of international law, no matter whether those bombers were British, German, American.